Today, I'm joined by retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Balan Ayyar. During his military career, he had the distinction of leading the Combined Joint Interagency Task Force in Afghanistan as commanding general. After retiring, General Ayyar became the CEO of a government services IT firm before founding percipient.ai, a VC-backed company advancing AI and computer vision for intelligence and security applications. We discuss Balan's military experience, AI's impact on national security, and the potential for AI to benefit society. This is Ripple Effects. General, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Well, it's a joy to be with you, Navin. Thanks so much for having me on this important podcast that you're developing great thoughts through.
Well, I'll call you Balan for the benefit of our listeners. And we'll just start from the beginning. You've got a long and storied military background. What inspired your initial decision? And sort of a two-part question. How has your experience as commanding general in Afghanistan influenced your leadership in the business and technology sectors?
Well, that spans my entire 25 years, 26 years of service, but I appreciate that because when I was graduating high school in Kansas, I thought for sure I was going to get to go to, a good school. You're a graduate of a really incredible institution on the East Coast. These institutions were producing such brilliant people. I thought I'd get a chance to do that too. But my mom, who was then and probably still today, she's suffering from dementia and full-time care, but she now, in those days, the sun rose and set on my mom's guidance and influence, and she decided that she thought it'd be great for me to go to the Air Force Academy and serve our nation. Her family had served in India. Her brothers were Air Force pilots, Indian Air Force pilots, and I knew that she loved them deeply. But at the time, it kind of fed into, in my mind's eye, you want to please your parents when you're young. And I was inspired by the stories that she told and that I'd read about with my uncles. And so I was disappointed and saddened a little bit that she thought that was the right course for me. But as it turns out, as you know, you follow your parents' guidance and you kind of, trust that they understand a little bit about life. And fast forward now to the commanding general role, which is my last role in the profession of arms, had a wonderful 25 plus years of service. What kept me in, Navin, interestingly, and I know you're kind of a merit-based guy too, was the Air Force. First, it aligned to my values. It's great to serve something bigger than yourself and to kind of have the humility and the kind of crushing blows of constant meritorious assessment, building you into the best version of yourself, which is what happens in the service. That kind of pinnacle of that was commanding combat for me as a young general officer in joint forces. And I had served, as you know, as a military assistant to the Secretary of Defense prior to that and led the Air Force recruiting service. But it all came together in that kind of culminating mission in Afghanistan. And the things that I drew from that into business, which I'm pleased to report to you now after some 10 years in business, is that the things that fundamentally build high-performing teams in the profession of arms are also what builds trust in the business sector and builds great companies in the business sector, the culture of high performance, the expectations, the discipline, the rigor, the tenacity, the will. Actually, all the things that you know and I know are required for our nation to succeed on the world stage in the military and in the other disciplines that make up our foreign policy are required in business as well. You want to grow as a business, build trust with your customers. You want to grow as a business, have exquisite capabilities, focus on them, understand the problem you're solving, and deliver those capabilities. You want to have a great company, build shared purpose and culture that drives high performance. Those are the things that I took out of my experience in combat as a commanding general and I put into place leading a previous company. That company did very well, largely because of the people that we were able to put in place. So credit to them. I looked good on paper and went out, as you know, we've known each other, many years now, went out and pitched and was able to get support from really great investors in the Valley that are involved in what you're involved in, and that is bringing the best technologies to bear from our innovation ecosystem into the United States missions, national security and intelligence missions that we know are so important for us to succeed in this coming decade and potentially the next century against these emerging adversaries. So I think trust, the importance of high performance, and we may talk about this a little further, but what I saw there was the kind of leverage that technology provides us to keep our intelligence and decision advantage, and the importance of that, and the kind of precipitous decline I saw in that as other nations were using that as an asymmetric advantage against us and able to do, essentially harm. We weren't able to protect, prevent, or predict attacks in a way that could protect our forces in Afghanistan. And so that experience there, the attacks that took place, and how I believed if we had a human and machine team, we might have been able to detect those unfolding attacks and protect our forces from them. That's what drove me to pitch and to ultimately build the company that we're in now.
I definitely want to hear a lot more about Recipient. You do have a story about, I believe, your uncle serving in the Indian military as a pilot. That's quite the dramatic story. Do you mind sharing that a bit for our audience?
When I was 8 or 9, my mom shared with me the kind of clippings from 1961 when my uncle Ganeshan was killed, flying out of a little air base in southern India called Tambram, all mystical and mythical to me. I was growing up in Southern California. India was a faraway place that was kind of out of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, some kind of mystical place. But it all became real when I read that little article about the president of India awarding my mom's elder brother and her father, my grandfather, in other than in the face of the enemy, award for valor for his decision to stay with the aircraft after asking his co-pilot to eject so that he could prevent it from hitting this little village in southern India called Chengalpet. And it ended up crashing, as you can imagine, in a cashew grove outside of the village. The controls were such that if he held them in a certain way, he knew the aircraft as it was descending would veer away from the village, as his co-pilot told the story. But yeah, it crashed, and the villagers came upon him. He asked if his co-pilot had lived, if the parachute was seen, if anyone was hurt on the ground. And when they confirmed to him that no one was hurt in this accident, he passed on, big, kind of gash in his forehead. So for me as an 8-year-old boy, it was pretty inspiring. I thought, man, I didn't know what the Kirti Chakra or what this award was, but for me, he was a hero. And, kind of flash forward to the question you first asked about my mom asking me to go to the Air Force Academy. The first thing that came to mind was that story of my uncle and how kind of noble and heroic he was from my perspective as a young boy growing up in America, not close to the family that my parents had immigrated from. And in those days, you only had letters to write back and forth. So it was kind of pen pals, if you will, with your cousins, if you kept in touch with them at all, with all the opportunities we had in America to be outside and to play. It was hard for me to write my cousins, and so I didn't grow up very close to them. But at that moment, when my mom sent me to the Air Force Academy, I thought, well, I can go fly jets for a couple of years. What fun that would be, and kind of represent my family as a first-generation Indian immigrant. There weren't, in that time, Navin, as you might know from policy, there were only 100 families a year that could immigrate from South Asia and India until 1965. My father arrived here in 54, was accepted in 52, but came in 54, and then went back and married my mom and brought her back. There were just a few families in America that had emigrated from South Asia. And so I grew up largely as not having seen a lot of Indian Americans in my schools. I was the first Indian American from the Air Force Academy to graduate. And then obviously for a number of reasons, because there just wasn't a lot of Indian Americans serving in the military, I was the first Indian American general. My uncle was an inspiration to me, just to give you an idea of how great America is. In my service, I was planning to leave the service after 5 or 6 years. And then out comes from the United States Air Force this call for volunteers. You had to be fighter qualified to volunteer for the first exchange pilot to the Indian Air Force that the U.S. Air Force had been negotiating. This is 1995. And I was ready to get out of the service and to go into business and to get my graduate degree. And I was a young instructor pilot in the U.S. Air Force. And here comes this opportunity, and I compete. The United States Air Force doesn't pick you on how you look. They evaluate your records. They evaluate your flight evaluation folder. They evaluate your meritorious annual assessments. And I was chosen. There was only 5 or 6 folks that wanted to compete for that opportunity, but I was chosen. To my knowledge, there was only 5 or 6. And can you imagine, Navin, 35 years later to the day that my uncle lost his life? I flew over that village, roared over that village as the first U.S. Air Force American pilot flying with the Indian Air Force in an Indian Air Force jet, single-engine jet, representing the United States in the land of my forefathers, flying out of the base that my uncle had flown out of that was so inspirational to me. And that can only happen in America, Navin, that you can grow up in a land of opportunity, compete meritoriously. I might not have been selected. I was. India was rather disappointed. They were expecting probably a blue-eyed Caucasian fighter pilot. And here they get this guy that's emigrated. Exactly. It's a great story, but it just reminds me, America is still an exceptional country. If you work hard, you play by the rules, you have this kind of sense of, confidence, inner confidence, great opportunities unfold. And that was just one of those cases where you can't make that story up, right? I got the U.S. flag on my right shoulder. I'm the nephew of Ganeshan, who's an Indian Air Force hero flying out of that base, and I'm representing the United States Air Force. It's just a great story.
That is a great story. Moving to what you're doing now, as the founder and CEO of Percipient, what are the core technologies that you're working on, and how are these innovations helping U.S. national security?
Well, I'm so happy that you asked that, Navin. I know your love is thinking about how the intersection of all of these things that are unfolding in the world allow us to preserve our freedom of action and preserve our values and strengthen America and its partners. Important to CSI is that we maintain the kind of frameworks, the Western liberal frameworks that have secured the peace since World War II. And it's no exaggeration to suggest that the advent of these technologies could change the dynamic in our ability to accomplish these important national missions against China and Russia and others. And it comes out of the theme of the questions you already asked me. I knew in 2013 when I left Afghanistan that the country that was able to harness the power, the compute power and the algorithms to understand the world ahead of our adversaries or ahead of your adversaries was going to be the one that was going to be best able to have intelligence advantage and decision advantage in conflict and in the earliest stages of preliminary stages of a potential conflict. And so I knew then we didn't have either the compute power or the algorithms necessary in 2013, but about 2017, it started to become apparent that we could. And so the technologies we're working on come out of my experience in Afghanistan. We're the leading intelligence analysis platform for visual intelligence. Mirage integrates all kinds of signals. You can imagine the kinds of signals that we watch for and listen for abroad. But we obviously, in many cases, in the Air Force, we would slew to the visual environment to confirm, for lots of reasons, before we act on a target, that we know what it is that we're targeting and that we understand the implications of targeting that asset objective. We believe firmly that we weren't taking advantage of all of the ground, air, and space-based data, visual data that we accumulate. So we collect and store, but we don't actually analyze a huge majority of it because we don't have the tools in place. So Mirage is the platform that we've built that allows intelligence and security operators to analyze, triage, alert on the things that are happening around them that are relevant to their mission risk. So you can imagine we could find if Navin or Balan had ever been seen before together, what vehicle they drove. We could look at that from air and space. We could look at geofenced areas and alert on changes that are happening. And what we tried to do in our platform was bring kind of cutting edge capabilities to that environment without the need for a data scientist. So just a few years ago, we thought maybe you need foundational models to detect different objects and capabilities from space. It turns out the breakthrough math and compute and algorithms we have now allow Mirage to do that without a data scientist. You can use natural language and query in near real time visual streams that our nation collects and that, frankly, other businesses, both in commercial security and law enforcement and other understanding that can be derived from those, they're relevant to lots of different commercial sectors. They just happen to be almost priceless in intelligence and national security. So we started out with visual intelligence, and we got a very extensive platform that now we've developed that allows, kind of our nation to stay ahead of our adversaries in those environments.
That makes sense. Can you give an example, maybe not violating any top security clearance, on a specific situation that it might be used for, maybe a fictional one based upon some real life possibilities? We're looking for a terrorist somewhere.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's exactly right. You can imagine we might have terabytes of data from an area in Europe where a terrorist attack took place or a potential attack took place. And we would want to kind of triage. I'll give you a few capabilities that Mirage has as an example. You can look at two organizations in Syria in Mirage. One may be a nonprofit, another might be Russian. And you can ask Mirage, who are the common folks that appear in these organizations over time? And you can kind of start to derive what networks are operating in an area that we may be operating in. You could certainly ask Mirage against petabytes of data. Have we seen these vehicles, these persons, these objects before, coming out of the courthouse? Is there a certain backpack? Is there a certain object that is of interest to us? And so you can use these capabilities to find frequent common persons. You can certainly build out the network. Looking at a terabyte of data, you might say, hey, these are Navin's closest associates, as we are able to derive that from where he operates in Sweden. So there are lots of things that may be of interest to us. And of course, as you know, we have big repositories, still image repositories that potentially we've collected and analyzed to suggest who our threats are in different parts of the world. And we can alert on those, live stream or looking at historic data, we can alert on their presence and build patterns of life that may be indicative of important threats that are unfolding, and we can alert on the first indication of those threats. So just as an example, the geospatial module You can geofence a railway transfer point in Russia. Commercial low Earth orbit is now proliferating quickly. You can just put your credit card down and buy geospatial data providers that have low Earth orbit satellites. And Mirage will, as that data comes down into your cloud, Mirage will automatically analyze that data and alert in that geofence when there are tanks or rocket forces or surface-to-air missile systems that you may be interested in. And you wouldn't want your analysts and operators to have to analyze that massive TIFF that's coming down from the satellite. You'd want the machine vision to do some basic analytical work with pretty good mission accuracy so that your folks can stay at a higher level of cognitive understanding, kind of characterizing and contextualizing the threats, rather than doing the more mundane review of all of the commercial low Earth overhead that's moving over that target. So, we have the ability now. The human brain is still the cosmos, as I like to say, for characterization and contextualization, for understanding the why and what's happening. But, with a 10 to the 5th or 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 7th capability in terms of neural processing with the latest AI-enabled capabilities, we can do some things that can be quite helpful to the human brain. The human brain doesn't really want to look at 2,000 hours of visual data to find out how many times Balan's brown BMW has been seen around these two organizations. If you let the machine vision do that and correlate kind of the hits and the patterns, you can then drop into that visual data and confirm the network relationships and the presence and the pattern of life. As a human operator or analyst, having all of that triage is quite advantageous.
So essentially, the government or governments or anyone that's using your platform can, if they wanted to track 100 different geofence locations where probably your AI told them that these are the top 100 that this particular network is going to be operating in, as soon as there's a hit of someone in a network meeting, they would get an alert and they would know to review that information.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you can use North Korea as an example, you might imagine that it's important for us to know when they're setting up for a test of a missile to provoke our treaty ally, Japan, or threaten our forces in South Korea. And, now that, we can watch from space many of the areas they use to test, at the first indication of the setup for a test, we can alert and, kind of vibrate the phones of the people that find that to be important to know. And these are the capabilities. And you can use natural language now, right? You have live streams all over the city I'm in currently, Reston. You can ask any of them if they're in Mirage, hey, I'm looking for a gentleman wearing shorts with a tattoo on his leg. And you don't have to have a detector for a tattoo. You don't have a detector for a man. You don't have to have a detector for a goatee. Mirage will take that natural language embedding, translate it in its multimodal capabilities into the image understanding, and it'll alert on the people that are walking around Reston with shorts and a leg tattoo. One example of many that you can imagine may be helpful. If you're a bank, you might have these cameras on your perimeter watching for someone carrying a weapon that's not in a police uniform. Somebody gets out of a car carrying a weapon outside a bank, that could be of concern to the bank. Unfortunately, it won't potentially prevent loss of life outside the bank, but the bank itself can recognize that threat and take appropriate action to prevent, what they think the intent of that person outside the bank with a weapon is. So these are the kinds of ways in which vision now are starting to augment human decision making, and we're at the forefront of that.
As putting the average American hat on, does this imply that we are all being watched 24/7 by our government?
No, I wouldn't assume that. Thankfully, Navin, we live in a republic where the roles and authorities are clearly established for the different law enforcement and intelligence agencies. I do think it's worth thinking about kind of the digital self that you have, the data that your phone is emitting in terms of its location, the applications you're using, how much information about yourself you're giving out for convenience to the different applications and other interactions you have with the digital world. I do think that's worth thinking about. I do think the kind of value of your data, you should be concerned about it being used publicly or without your intention by other parties. So that broadly, I think, is worth reflecting on. I don't think I would extend that to what you shared with me, and that is that, are we constantly being surveilled by our own government? I think in the republics, at least, from my perspective, the United States in particular, but certainly the great nations that voting still matters in, that those nations, including Europe broadly, where you are right now, is looking very precisely at these tech companies in the way that they gather information about their customers, and where that data is and what they learn from are all becoming scrutinized now in a way that I think helps protect us, Navin. I do think we should be cognizant that there are a lot of cameras when we travel in foreign locations. And I do think that in many foreign locations, we are being surveilled. Jokingly, we call it a ubiquitous technical surveillance environment because if I go to a foreign land, it's not necessarily guaranteed that I won't be watched by that nation, depending on their laws, and potentially being tracked by either my phone or by visual cameras. I think these kinds of capabilities now are being used by China and Russia and other, I would say, nefarious actors to the Western liberal frameworks that kind of have governed peace in the world over the last 70 or 80 years. Do you think that this ubiquitous technical surveillance has impact to our national security and intelligence missions, but not so much so to the average person in Sweden or the average person in America? I think largely the cameras that we find in the public square are intended forensically to help prevent crime or protect us from crime. I still think we're operating in a place in Western liberal democracies with regards to our government. But I would say that you are being surveilled either electronically or visually much more broadly now than you ever have been, because the prevalence of these cameras is just so great. You're in Europe. It's not unknown that London has a lot of cameras, right? People of London have largely wrestled with this and decided that they want to be able to prosecute crime if it happens. And so they're comfortable with these cameras there, right? By the way, it's not so common in America. People in America really value their privacy, even in the public square. Listen, China is using this technology to both control its own people and influence its region and the world, uncovering where we're operating in the way that we operate and trying to conceal the way they operate and use influence in these other nations to affect their kind of Belt and Road. And I know this is of interest to you, but I would just say, just to close it, there is no question that our adversaries are using both their private sector and hardware that they're selling around the world to gain a national intelligence advantage over broadly the Western liberal nations of the world, including Europe and America. And I think our firm, Percipient AI, is in the center of that battle to provide American innovation and capabilities out of Silicon Valley, where we're based, where we think, because we operate with data scarcity, that we have the best capabilities in the world in certain areas. We believe that the right course is for America's national security and defense establishments to look first at Silicon Valley. By the way, by Silicon Valley, I mean Austin and Boston and all the places where this kind of people are taking risk. You're a venture capitalist. And what we have that are better than any place else in the world is we have venture capitalists that understand risk, that are willing to invest in far-reaching technologies. And as a result, we have great companies like NVIDIA and others that are generating the engines and the capabilities, even in the application layer, like our firm, that could potentially change the world with these technologies. So because we have venture capitalists like you that have a long view to risk and to transformational technologies, we're able to develop companies in America that can influence the world in a positive way. And our adversaries are using it, operationalizing their own private sector as autocracies can to try and counter that. And so, we're in our own fight here to make sure that our defense and national security establishment actually adopts commercial capabilities rather than trying to develop kind of antiquated software in the traditional way that defense primes often do, custom government-owned software, which doesn't have access to the kind of latest innovations that we know exist in the commercial sector.
That makes sense. And I'm curious, if you were the Secretary of Defense, knowing what you know about Chinese and Russian capabilities in this area, where would you be investing in America's machine learning and AI capabilities on the defense side? What technologies might you be implementing? Perhaps it's cybersecurity and not AI, but where would you really be beefing up our defenses in that regard?
It's clear that our nation and our Defense Department in particular is lagging in adoption of commercial best-in-class software and other capabilities that are driving the most valuable companies in the world out of Silicon Valley. The engines for that incredible wealth that they're creating, incredible influence they're creating, is in the U.S. innovation around artificial intelligence and other technologies. But I think if I were the Secretary of Defense, I would say, hey, let's look at what our adversaries are doing to leverage these technologies against us. And let's take a hammer to the acquisition and procurement system that's preventing the adoption, evaluation, validation, and quicker integration of U.S. technologies. And I think fundamentally, I think you know this too, for a little while, we were so focused on success in business, we outsourced many of the manufacturing and technologies and everything from minerals forward. We went to the closest place in the world that we could manufacture these things thinking that, we were talking about peace and harmony for the next 100 years and we never have risk to our global supply chains. So I think I would look fundamentally at the technologies that Russia and China and other actors in the world that we think we're threatened by over the next 30 years, how they're leveraging those technologies, and I would take immediate action, probably by executive authority, to make sure that we have a much more aggressive position to partner with the private sector in America that are leading in these technologies and have great national security and intelligence outcomes. I mean, we are fighting, Navin, with really breathtaking capabilities ahead of what the government is asking to build. We're fighting to get the government, our own government, to evaluate these technologies and adopt them rather than spending hundreds of millions of dollars in development, risky development, to build a government software that does largely the same thing and in 5 years will be antiquated at the time that it's delivered.
You mentioned a few $100 million that someone's going to develop an internal government.
Well, this is incredible.
Who's actually getting that contract? Is someone hiring 100 developers at the DoD?
These are defense primes that want to build software. They're incentivized because they make their profit on the number of people that they have in seats to do this development. Would they be? They're just not incentivized to adopt a commercial software that's best in class. They're incentivized to put 300 people in seats because that money's obligated already and given to that agency. They want to develop that software because it's highly defensible for them if they're the ones that develop the software. Even though the government owns it, they'll be in that agency for the next 20 years supporting that software. So they're highly motivated and incentivized to develop rather than license. And the problem is the criticality of these technologies. That prime that I referenced in the Federal Circuit case has 23,000 employees and not a single patent in computer vision. Just the top 5 scientists in my firm have 71 patents at last count.
I mean, basically what you're saying is that instead of spending our tax dollars efficiently to go to our private sector, which is by definition the best in the world at creating these kinds of technologies, the United States government is actually trying to develop its own cutting-edge technology with likely second, third, and fourth tier personnel, no experience, and no intellectual horsepower on the patenting side, and no incentives. I mean, as someone in the private sector or anyone that's even any average American would think that's just about the dumbest thing you could do with $500 million.
Yeah, that's about the dumbest thing you can do. And I can tell you, I can give you example after example. We've spent $500 million on Maven. No warfighting command adopted that. It was awarded to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and now they're working on geospatial capabilities. None of their FMV work was adopted. We spent $500 million. They came to see us in 2017, and we told them, don't build a bolt-on object detector. You have to understand the mission problem you're solving. You need a workflow and a great product, or nobody will adopt it. Well, they didn't listen to us. They used Google and other companies to build these capabilities for the government. And of course, the government customers that would use that technology said, hey, this workflow doesn't work for us. You have to understand how products are built, which is what you do, and what Silicon Valley investors understand. They understand if you build a bad product, nobody adopts it. It's only in the government you can build a bad product and force people to adopt. It's antiquated from the time it's developed. And there's so much sunk cost in it. So we've got to break the procurement. And by the way, CSIS has got a great report on this. One of my favorite reports, chaired by Avril Haines, who then became the DNI. But it's a beautiful report in 2020 that says, hey, China, Russia, and others are operationalizing AI as a lever against us in the intelligence and national security community. We need to adopt best-in-class commercial AI as quickly and as rapidly as possible. And the CSIS report goes on to say the consequences in the next 10 years are going to be catastrophic for us. We won't have intelligence advantage, and there'll be a launch or potential attack that causes conflict that could have been controlled had we done what you just suggested, which is use the common sense approach, where we have best-in-class commercial capabilities. Let's look to integrate them. They're built by American companies that are leading the way in AI. Why wouldn't we want our American national security and intelligence organizations to have it?
That makes a lot of sense. We should probably try to close on an optimistic note.
Sure.
I was going to ask you, what are the potential dangers you see if AI is used to our detriment? But maybe we can touch upon that for a second, but end on the question of, given all the expansive applications that AI could potentially be used for, what are some of the more positive ways it could be used?
To that first part of the question, I would say that, I like to kind of orient a little bit differently than we're oriented now, Navin. I often tell people that nobody buys AI. They buy capabilities that help them win, that are powered by the new capabilities that artificial intelligence and these neural networks and different applications can provide.
Right. They buy solutions to problems.
And really, to be truthful, they don't care if it's quantum or if it's AI that's supporting their solutions. They just want to make sure it's trustworthy, repeatable, robust, and largely secure, and that they can tailor it to their mission set. That's what they want to pay for, is a mission solution. And so the first thing I would say is that you'll find narrowly tailored applications in AI accelerating human understanding in various disciplines. I'm so excited about the potential for health. You can imagine why. Massive amounts of data. We might be able to detect the earliest signs of the way a cell changes for cancer. If you're using it in detection in oncology, you might find, as you know, the ability to kind of do analysis in AI about the different forms of proteins and the different forms of drugs that could treat diseases is very exciting. The compute power there is extraordinary. So there's so many areas where AI is going to make us feel like a humankind, not separate nations, but that we're one race, the human race, and it's going to bring us together if we use artificial intelligence to help find better ways to feed, to create clean water, to create clean air, to ensure that we responsibly understand the impact over time to the environment. There's so many ways that AI is going to be quite effective. In terms of the dangers, I do think that you can accelerate this understanding for harm. So if you're China, for example, and you're trying to control your people, this is a great system to help control your people, right? There's no question. You can detect if they're thinking more liberal ideas than they should be. You can prosecute them because you have the ability to detect the first changes in a pattern that you think potentially indicates harm. And of course, for the nations that are less free, these systems, combined with surveillance, as you talked about, the ability to recognize threats is pretty high. What you deem as a threat depends on what nation you're in. And so there is some concern we have about the use of our technologies by nations to oppress. And we want to be careful about the ability for surveillance and other technologies to be used in a way that harms our values. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that. But overall, Navin, there's probably never been a better time. Used the right way, I think we'll be able to have breakthrough applications for security, for public safety. If you think about it, accelerating human understanding, Navin, it's almost limitless the way that the increased power of both data and compute are going to allow humans. I think the key piece here, Navin, that I'd like to leave you with that I think is optimistic, at least I believe is optimistic, is that for the foreseeable future, from Balan's perspective, reasonable people could probably disagree about this, it's not the machines making independent decisions changing the course of our future. It is the machine intelligence, if you can call it intelligence. It's really largely with LLMs and others statistical in nature. It's really this capability in compute and application of that compute and various layers of these neural nets helping humans make better decisions, more precise decisions, understanding history and patterns more precisely. They're able to be more decisive and more capable in their understanding before they make decisions. So we're in an era of accelerated human understanding, which in various disciplines is going to lead to better outcomes in health, in conflict among nations. We'll be able to detect things that are happening earlier. And as a result, as you know, we'll use our influence to avoid conflict. Nobody wants conflict. So I'm really optimistic about our ability, and maybe we can end on the North Korea example. When we see something happening in North Korea now, within a few hours of it happening, without taking thousands of people to watch all the different sources of data and have alerting going on, we can let him know, listen, the consequences of what you're about to do are serious. Don't do it. We know what you're thinking. We know what you're building for. And so this idea that we can use other levers of power to avoid conflict is very exciting to me. Once somebody does something that goes past the tipping point of a reaction, boy, it becomes tough to untie that because the consequences can be very high in today between nations with conflict. So I'm actually very optimistic, Navin. I agree with you that we have to be very thoughtful about how these capabilities and how data is used to achieve these outcomes. We didn't touch on it, but I'm a firm believer in building trust in the way that we develop these technologies so that people can believe that they're used for good purposes, they've been trained the right way, and their intended outcome, the intention, is a positive intention for the use of the software. And I think we're going to have to take, you as a technologist and investor are going to have to take some responsibility for making sure the technologies you're investing in are used in the right way to achieve that intended outcomes. We can't just hope for the best and try and make money anymore. The consequences are too great.
I think that's about as optimistic as we're going to get, Balans. Thank you so much for your time. And I forgot to thank you for your service earlier. And it certainly gives me and should give our listeners confidence that someone like you with your mindset of service to the country is building these types of technologies with the intention of helping Americans and our national security. So thanks for what you're doing.
Well, Navin, let me just say the last word, and that's thanks to you. I'm so pleased with leaders like you who understand what's at stake, who understand the technologies that are involved, who understand the values that are in tension between nations, and have podcasts like this to help kind of tease out of different leaders that are involved so that you can have thought-provoking discussions about how CSIS and others can help the world advance in the right way. So I still believe that America is an exceptional story for the world in world history, and we're living it right now. So thank you so much, Navin. Have a great day. God bless.
Thank you.